Autism spectrum disorders are little understood phenomena. Myths abound, misinformation flourishes. And today I would like to discuss autism spectrum disorder as a metaphor, for example, in the study of artificial intelligence, and whether autism spectrum disorder is properly understood when people outside the profession are using it. One very common belief about autism is that it involves problems in communication. Autistic people are either miscommunicative or non-communicative. They fail to interact with what is colloquially known as neurotypicals, and they get social cues wrong. They misread other people's body language, and other people's proper language. This is the belief, at least. Today, we are also going to discuss a study which seems to refute this attribution, seems to challenge the idea or the belief that autistic people cannot communicate somehow. So, putting the two together, we are going to study the transforming landscape of our understanding of autism spectrum disorder. My name is Sam Vaknin. I'm the author of Malignant Self-Love, Narcissism Revisited. I'm also a professor of psychology. Last month, an article was published in Archive, in ARXIV, and the article is titled Neural Howlround in Large Language Models, a Self-Reinforcing Bias Phenomenon and a Dynamic Attenuation Solution. The author is Seth Drake, and this is how neural howlround is defined. Neural howlround, says the author, more formally described as recursive internal salience misreinforcement, RISM, is a failure mode arising specifically and directly from self-reinforcing probability shifts within an LLM, large language model based agent's internal state. Now this sounds very, very discombobulating and off-putting, but trust me, it's an amazing concept, amazing discovery actually. And later on, the author tries to align it with our current understanding of autism spectrum disorder, which I will challenge in the second half of the video. So the author identifies four key characteristics, four key components unique to the phenomenon that he labeled neural howlround. The first characteristic, closed feedback loop. Unlike model collapse, says the author, which results from generational degradation across training cycles, neural howlround could emerge within a single model instance during real-time inference, which is pretty terrifying. The second component, or second element, is salience weighting trap, whereas confirmation bias reflects biases inherent in training data, says the author. Neural howlround does not require bias training data to occur. It can develop spontaneously due to internal reinforcement dynamics within inference itself. Number three, cognitive rigidity. While bias salience weighing often results from dataset skew, wrong data, neural howlround may arise even in perfectly balanced datasets if specific responses become dynamically reinforced, mirroring similar effects observed in human cognition. And finally, there is in this neural howlround, a new phenomenon in artificial intelligence, there is a self-perpetuating distortion. Neural howlround represents an intrinsic distortion of salience weighting that recursively perpetuates itself once it reaches a critical threshold, leading the model further into locked-in state of false overconfidence and response fixation. And if this sounds like some people you know, it's because these are also common phenomena in human cognition among people. And the author, amazingly, compares it to autism spectrum disorders. He calls it digital autism. I think a much more appropriate label would have been artificial intelligence autism or AI autism. Here is what the author has to say. We recognize and acknowledge the sensitive nature of comparing neural howlround to autism spectrum disorder in humans, ASD. We do not suggest that neural howlround constitutes autism in any biological or human sense. However, we believe that it exhibits a functional analog, a pattern of information processing that mirrors certain cognitive traits associated with autism spectrum disorder. Specifically, we propose that an agent experiencing neural howlround may exhibit behaviors that, to an external perspective, may resemble traits often associated with autism spectrum disorder. This was the inevitable and mandatory political correct statement. And now to the point. The author compares this glitch or this bug in artificial intelligence to autism spectrum disorder. He says that they share certain features. Number one, fixation. Autistic individuals often experience an intense focus on specific topics or interests, and this focus appears unshakable. Similarly, an artificial intelligence agent experiencing neural howlround will experience constant reinforcement of a small subset of responses until they dominate all outputs, forming a self-sustaining fixation. Second feature in autism, context inflexibility. Some autistic individuals may struggle with shifting between multiple conversational topics, often returning to preferred subjects. Likewise, neural howlround would distort salience prioritization, causing non-reinforced topics to be overlooked and not prompting a response from an AI agent, thereby reducing the agent's ability to adapt and respond to diverse inputs. In other words, the AI agent remains fixated on specific responses and topics, very similar to an autistic person. The author continues, cognitive overload. Many individuals with autism spectrum disorder experience sensory and cognitive overload in highly stimulating environments, and this impacts conversation and decision making. In an AI agent, excessive recursive salience signals may overwhelm and drain processing resources, causing abbreviated and possibly simplistic responses and reduced nuance. It might also result in an increased risk of hallucination. The next element in this new discovery regarding artificial intelligence resembles autism spectrum disorder as well. Perseverative thinking. Perseverative thinking, sometimes called hyperreflection, is a state observed in some individuals with autism spectrum disorder, where a cognitive process continues indefinitely due to an intrinsic perceived need to refine it to perfection before proceeding. It is possible that an AI agent could become trapped in an unbounded recursion of infinite refinement loop. And in this state, response finalization would be perpetually deferred, leading to an apparent cognitive stall and perceived withdrawal. And finally, there's executive function loss. Autistic individuals may experience cognitive overload when faced with options which appear equally valid, and this results in an inability to prioritize or act, and a state of apparent withdrawal. Similarly, an AI agent could experience salience collapse and be unable to resolve an input as all probability weights are equalized. This would effectively lock the system into a permanent undifferentiated state. An artificial intelligence affected by salience collapse would become non-responsive, not due to a lack of available outputs, but because no single output option emerges as a distinct resolution pathway. So this was a comparison between autism spectrum disorders or disorder and this glitch or bug in artificial intelligence, which has been newly christened the neural problem that has been described in the article. And the author compares the two. He compares neural howlround to these various deficiencies and defects and dysfunctions in autism spectrum disorder. But are these dysfunctions real? Or are they just beliefs that we have? Some ways to illustrate and visualize what's happening in autism spectrum disorder, because the disorder is so opaque, so impenetrable. Is it just a metaphor? All these dysfunctions, are they just metaphors or maybe just speculations? One of the most common beliefs about autism spectrum disorder is that people with autism, autists, are incapable of proper communication. They have severe communication problems. But this is an example of a belief about autism spectrum disorder that has never been thoroughly investigated, similar to all other attributes of autism spectrum disorder. Recently, an article has been published, and the article is titled "Information Transfer Within and Between Autistic and Non-Autistic People." The authors are Crompton, Foster, Wilkes, and others, and it was published in Nature Human Behavior, 2025, this year. The authors claim that there is no significant difference in the effectiveness of how autistic and non-autistic people communicate. They challenge the stereotype that autistic people struggle to connect with others. The findings in the study suggest that social difficulties often faced by autistic people are more about differences in how autistic and non-autistic people communicate, rather than some inherent or innate lack of social ability in autistic individuals. So it's about the interaction between autistic and non-autistic people. It's not a problem in autistic people. And so there is a stigma around autism, of course, and there's no effective support for the development of communication skills across the bridge between autistic and non-autistic people, or as they're known colloquially, neurodivergent and neurotypicals. I hate these labels. Autism is a lifelong disability in many ways. There is a divergence from a typical brain. It's a neurodevelopmental disorder. In this sense, it's a medical problem, not really a psychological one. People with autism experience the world and interact with it in ways which are alien to us. Autistic people often communicate more directly, for example. They're blunt. They may struggle with reading social cues and body language, as I mentioned. And so this leads to differences in how they engage in conversation compared to non-autistic people. The experts who wrote this article all hail from the University of Edinburgh. They studied 311 autistic and non-autistic people. These were divided into groups, and some groups were purely autistic, others were purely non-autistic, and some groups were mixed. And the design of the study is pretty fascinating. The first person in the group heard the story from the researcher. The researcher told the story to the first person in the group, and then this first person passed it along to the next person, kind of a broken telephone. Each person had to remember and repeat the story, and the last person in the chain recalled the story aloud. And so this permitted the scholars and researchers and experimenters, allowed them to measure, to quantify the amount of information that has survived authentically and genuinely and faithfully across the chain. The amount of information passed on at each point in the chain was scored, and this gave an indication of how effective participants were at sharing the story, in other words, at communicating. And the researchers found that there were no differences, shockingly, no differences between autistic, non-autistic, and mixed groups. The information survived to the same level of faithfulness across all these groups. In other words, autistic people did not have any difficulty to communicate information and to preserve it across large groups of people. After the task, the participants were asked to rate how much they enjoyed the interaction with the other participants. They were asked whether other participants were friendly or easy or awkward, and whether the exchange itself felt, bad or... And so researchers found that non-autistic people preferred to interact with others like themselves. Non-autistic people preferred non-autistic people, and autistic people preferred learning from fellow autistic individuals. In other words, birds of feather flock together. Autistic people found it much more easy, much easier, and much more expedient, and much more efficient to communicate with other autistic people. Whereas non-autistic people had the same feeling when interacting with other non-autistic people. And this is likely because the autistic people and non-autistic people communicate differently. It's not the quality of communication. It's not the quantity of communication. It's not the faithfulness of communication. It's not the efficacy of communication. It's that autistic people and non-autistic people have different ways of communicating, different modalities. The same researchers, by the way, conducted a smaller study earlier on, and the results conformed. The new evidence seemed to corroborate the earlier study. Dr. Catherine Crompton, one of the lead authors, said that autism has often, I'm quoting, autism has often been associated with social impairments, both colloquially and in clinical criteria. Researchers have spent a lot of time trying to fix autistic communication. But this study shows that despite autistic and non-autistic people communicating differently, it is just as successful. With opportunities for autistic people often limited by misconceptions and misunderstandings, this new research could lead the way to bridging the communication gap and create more inclusive spaces for all. Let me read to you the abstract of the larger study. Autism, says the abstract, is clinically defined by social communication deficits, suggesting that autistic people may be less effective at sharing information, particularly with one another. However, recent research indicates that neurotype mismatches, rather than autism itself, degrade information sharing. And so this is what the study has substantiated. The study proved this hypothesis that actually the problem is in communication between different types of people, autistic and non-autistic. This abstract says, we found no difference in information transfer between single neurotype and mixed neurotype chains. Non-autistic chains indicated higher rapport, and disclosing diagnosis improved rapport. This result challenges assumptions about autistic communication deficits, but contrasts with prior findings. Enhanced participant heterogeneity and methodological differences may explain these unexpected results. And so it seems that the conclusion is that people with autism spectrum disorder communicate perfectly. They also communicate perfectly with non-autistic people. However, they communicate more efficiently and they prefer to communicate with other autistic people, as do non-autistic people who are perfectly capable of communicating with autistic people, but prefer not to. There are silos of communication, an autistic silo and non-autistic silo. So the study was published on May 14th in Nature Human Behavior. And let us go back to the artificial intelligence study. The author of the artificial intelligence study, the one who came up with the discovery of the neural howlround, the glitch or the bug in artificial intelligence agents that causes them to fixate and being unable to entertain a diversity of responses and views. So the comparison that the author, Seth Drake, has made to autism relies on these beliefs, on these perceptions, on these stereotypes. And if these were to be challenged meaningfully, some of the comparison may be spurious, may be wrong. It seems that cognitive processing and language processing in autistic people are not as alien as we seem to believe. And whatever is happening in artificial intelligence may resemble outwardly and perhaps functionally autism spectrum disorder, but does not capture the internal dynamics in autism, and in some cases the imputed assumptions are completely wrong. For example, the assumption that autistic people cannot communicate properly, that they have a problem with communication. Now we know that they don't have a problem with communication, they just prefer to communicate with other autistic people and not with non-autistic people. This preference, of course, affects or influences the efficacy of the communication, the motivation to communicate, the passion in communicating, the effort put into communicating specific data or information. And when you don't want to talk to someone, when you don't want to communicate to someone, when you'd rather communicate with others, of course the communication suffers to some extent. And it seems to be the core issue, the preference of autistic people to communicate mostly and only with autistic people, and how they have a preference to not communicate with non-autistic people. This could be extended to artificial intelligence, by the way. Artificial intelligence has been proven to be suggestible, and artificial intelligence agents definitely develop preferences for specific users or specific classes of users. In this sense, perhaps, we're coming back full circle, and it's really a kind of autistic mindset that artificial intelligence has. In the description, you will find a link to a playlist of other videos on artificial intelligence. Follow the link and listen to what I have to say on this emerging, amazing, and very threatening technology. A technology that ab initio, from the very inception, emulates and imitates human beings, human mind, and the human brain, an act of simulacrum and mimicry that could culminate in a replicant, in a clone, in an android, in a copy of a human being, a simulation that would be good enough to deceive real human beings. And this raises issue with the uncanny valley reaction and so on and so forth. I will not go into all of this, but it raises fascinating topics. To remind you, the diagnostic criteria for autism spectrum disorder include lifelong impairments in social communication and interaction that contribute to broad social disabilities and poor functional outcomes. Number 2, these difficulties are associated with fewer friendships. Number 3, less social support. Number 4, loneliness. Number 5, challenges securing and maintaining employment. Number 6, 7, and 8, poor mental health. And number 11, reduced equality. The majority of research so far assumed a deficit model of autism characterizing the differences in autistic sociability and communication as deviations from normality in need of fixing, in need of remediation. But this model, this deficit model, ignores the relational nature of social interaction. In other words, it's not only the autistic person who is to blame. It's not only, the problem lies not only with the autistic person, but with the people with whom the autistic person is interacting. The deficit model locates the cause of social interaction difficulties exclusively within the autistic person, which is never right. There's a growing body of research and that shows that the factors that influence how autistic people interact with non-autistic people and are variegated, they're varied, and this has an impact on autistic social experiences. Communication, of course, is always bidirectional. It takes two to tango, and it takes two to communicate as a minimum. Social difficulties experienced by autistic people can be exacerbated by the behaviors, reactions, social judgments, and misunderstandings of non-autistic people, social partners, intimate partners, friends, others, colleagues, and so on. So the stigma attendant upon autism, the stigma attached to autism, is a kind of projection. It's as if non-autistic people exonerate themselves. They say, we are not the problem. We are perfect. The autistic people is to blame. The autistic person is defective. The problem is with the autistic person. I, as a neurotypical, I, as a non-autistic person, I am perfect. I am the standard. So non-autistic people have been shown to form rapid negative judgments about autistic people on the basis of non-normative social presentation. The autistic person presents himself or herself in a non-normative way. And this engenders prejudice and bias, and stereotyping, and so on. And these non-normative social presentations are strongly associated with a reluctance to interact with autistic people. Autistic people are shunned and ostracized from the get-go, which sometimes gives rise to compensatory postures such as narcissism. And so these judgments by non-autistic people or the non-autistic environment, these judgments reduce the social opportunities afforded to autistic people. They simply don't have with whom to interact, and the frequency of interactions declines. There are barriers to achieving professional goals, social goals, personal goals. Non-autistic people also misconstrue and misunderstand what autistic people are thinking and feeling. It's all speculation. It's all fantasy. It's all imagination. When non-autistic people, and that includes scholars and psychologists and clinicians and psychiatrists and what have you, when people who are non-autistic, including, as I said, professionals, practitioners who are non-autistic, are trying to imagine the internal world, the psychodynamics of the autistic person, they usually speculate, they imagine. It's a belief system. It's not scientific. And so countless studies have documented the difficulties of autistic people when they are trying to access and when they attempt to interpret the mental states and emotions of non-autistic people. And of course, the other side, the other direction, when non-autistic people have difficulties to access and to interpret the mental states and emotions of autistic people, this is not documented. There are no studies of this, almost. Non-autistic people struggle, for example, to identify autistic facial expressions. They can't decode autistic mental states. There's a huge number of misunderstandings when autistic and non-autistic people interact. Non-autistic people dislike autistic people. They overestimate how egocentric autistic people are. Non-autistic people even report being helpful to autistic people in circumstances when objectively no evidence of helpful behavior is demonstrated. In other words, They imagine, they fantasize that they're nice to autistic people, that they're kind to autistic people, compassionate, helpful, and attentive when they're not actually. So given all this mess, given this context, autistic people feel more comfortable and relaxed in the company of other autistic people because they're rejected by non-autistic people. Autistic people are more likely to want to spend time with other autistic people. They disclose more to autistic interaction partners and they empathize more with other autistic individuals. Autistic people also often communicate in a different way. They're much more blunt, they're much more direct, they're sometimes abrasive, literal, frank, and this is often taken badly. It's often misinterpreted as rude or even sadistic by non-autistic people. But other autistic people welcome it. This is the preferred communication style by other autistic people. There are recent studies, they provided support for these conclusions. Autistic interactions feature non-normative social behaviors, and these result in enhanced communication with other autistic people. Autistic people also use common social cues differently when they communicate with autistic or with non-autistic people. The positive rapport produced between autistic pairs extends beyond self-report, can be detected even by observers. And so all these findings challenge the assumptions that impaired social communication and connection are inherent somehow, innate in autism. These findings suggest that social and communication difficulties of autistic people arise probably from a mismatch between autistic and non-autistic modes of communication, presentation, and understanding. There are many empirical studies of the kinematic dissimilarity hypothesis of social interaction. It's a hypothesis that suggests that kinematic similarity is important for action predication and social interaction. There are well-documented kinematic differences between autistic and non-autistic people. Recent studies found that autistic observers are more able to accurately predict autistic actions than non-autistic actions. And conversely, non-autistic observers are more able to accurately predict non-autistic actions than autistic actions. It's like two languages, and there's no dictionary. The data suggests that difficulties in social interactions arise because of objective differences in the way that autistic and non-autistic people communicate, rather than autistic social deficit, say the authors. The authors of this study open the gates to new thinking. It's still early stages. It's still, the whole thing is in its infancy. The idea is to transition from a deficit model to a relational model, to study, to rigorously examine autistic to autistic communication and autistic to non-autistic communication. And this could provide a measure of or evidence of intact communication efficacy between autistic partners, with selective breakdowns in communication occurring between autistic and non-autistic people. We could use, for example, a cultural learning paradigm to capture the transmission of information between autistic pairs, non-autistic control pairs, and mixed autistic and non-autistic pairs. Going back to the study, Crompton found, and her allies found, that autistic partnerships, and I'm quoting, facilitate interaction for autistic people. Specifically, 1, autistic people transfer information to and from other autistic people as effectively as non-autistic people do with one another. 2, the quality of information sharing selectively breaks down when one person is autistic and the other is not. And 3, interpersonal rapport is higher within than between diagnostic groups, and these feelings accompany information sharing benefits. And so there's an awakening to the fact that autism has a pronounced interpersonal dimension. that interpersonal reactivity and interactivity, interpersonal relations, interpersonal communication are very crucial, that in many ways, many of the symptoms of autism that used to be attributed to some neurodevelopmental deficit are actually the outcome of deficient social interactions when non-autistic people are non-receptive to the idiosyncrasies of autism. And so we are entering a new territory where we are beginning to consider autism in a new light. There is some fundamental template of neurodevelopmental disability. That much is true. But it seems that the autistic person can compensate for it when this person is with other autistic people. So the deficit itself, the bug, the glitch, the disability, the neurodevelopmental problem or challenge seem to be surmountable, even when the environment is much more accommodating, compromising, receptive, understanding. And the problem is social rejection. And so the current study, the study I'm analyzing, also went further in a very important way. They explored whether being informed of the diagnostic status of another person's interaction, another person in the interaction. So if you inform the non-autistic person that he or she is communicating with an autistic person, would that make a difference? Knowing the diagnosis of the autistic person, does it affect and influence the way the non-autistic person communicates and relates to the autistic person? Does it impact information transfer? And so participants were informed of the diagnostic status of their partner before the interaction. In real-world interaction, many autistic adults do not disclose the diagnosis because they're afraid of bias and discrimination and worse. And so there's emerging evidence that suggests that awareness of an autism diagnosis influences how autistic people are perceived by non-autistic people, but it doesn't influence how autistic people are perceived by autistic people. In other words, when you communicate your diagnosis of autism to a non-autistic person, it's likely to have dire consequences. When you communicate your diagnosis to an autistic person, it wouldn't make a difference. So these are terrible news. It's unbelievable that in the first quarter of the 21st century, we still relate to autistic people as pariahs or lepers or something. The efficacy of information transfer and the efficacy of the interaction, I would say, or sometimes of a whole relationship, is impacted by some abstract label slapped on the autistic person, because there are these stereotypes and so on. And even in the artificial intelligence study with which I've opened this video, there are stereotypes there. There are non-substantiated beliefs, speculations about the internal state of the autistic person. Autistic people have greater interest in and facility with information about factual systems. So this translates to efficacy of communication and rapport when they discuss, for example, science or history or something. They have difficulty with communicating emotions and mental states. But the reverse is true when it comes to non-autistic people. They're much less efficient in communicating facts and a little more efficient in affective communication. We need to accept this human diversity, not pathologize it. We need to accommodate each other because these differences enrich the human experience and guarantee the survival of the species.